I'm 78 years old, and I'll tell you something that took me most of my life to truly understand. The Bible isn't a book of ancient fairy tales, it's a book of warnings. And those warnings are more accurate, more precise, and more urgent than anything published in the last 100 years. Not because someone told me to believe it, because I've watched them come true. And the more years I accumulate, the more I understand that the people who dismissed these warnings didn't dismiss them because they were untrue. They dismissed them because they were inconvenient, because taking them seriously would have required changing something. Most people treat the Bible like a relic, something you dust off at Christmas, something you keep on the shelf to feel spiritual without being serious. They've reduced it to a comfort book, a collection of verses about peace and love and hope. And those things are real. But they've missed the warnings. They've skipped the parts that make you uncomfortable, and those parts, the ones people avoid, are the ones I've watched unfold with my own eyes across 8 decades of living on this earth. The comfortable parts of Scripture get quoted at weddings. The warning parts get ignored. And that selective reading is itself a kind of blindness the Bible already warned about. Start with what the Bible actually says about money, because this is where most people get it completely wrong. They've heard that money is the root of all evil. That's a misquote, and it changes everything. The actual verse says, "The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil." The distinction is not semantic, it's surgical. The Bible never said wealth was evil. It said the obsession with wealth, the reordering of your entire life around its pursuit, the willingness to compromise everything else for it, that is what destroys people. And here's what most people miss. It doesn't just say it destroys the greedy man. It says it causes people to pierce themselves through with many sorrows. That word, pierce, is violent. It's not a gentle decline. It's a wound you inflict on yourself, and you don't always see it happening until you're already bleeding out. Look at what's happened to the culture around money in the last 50 years. The people who built their entire identity around accumulation, who sacrificed relationships, health, integrity, purpose, most of them arrived at the end of that road and found it hollow. Not all of them, but enough to make the pattern undeniable. The Bible wasn't moralizing. It was describing a mechanism, a cause and effect built into the nature of things. And the mechanism works whether or not you believe in the book that describes it. That is the power of a true warning. It operates on you whether or not you acknowledge it. But it goes even deeper than that. Because the Bible's warnings about wealth connect directly to its warnings about power and about what happens to societies that chase both without restraint. In Proverbs, in Isaiah, in the letters of the apostles, you find this recurring pattern. When the leaders of a society begin to serve themselves rather than the people, when justice is bought and sold, when the gap between those who have everything and those who have nothing grows so wide that it becomes structural, the society begins to rot from the inside. Not from the outside, from within. Always from within. I've watched that pattern play out in real time. Not in one country, in many. The warnings were written down thousands of years ago, and they described with uncomfortable accuracy what happens when institutions become self-serving, when those in authority lose accountability, when the measure of a civilization becomes its economic output rather than its treatment of the most vulnerable members. The Book of Amos, which most people have never read, is essentially a prosecutorial indictment of a society that had become wealthy and religious while allowing its poor to be crushed. God doesn't sound polite in that book. He sounds furious. And the reason he sounds furious is that the people being warned already knew better. They had the instructions. They chose to ignore them because ignoring them was profitable. And here's the real power in understanding this. The biblical warnings were never just predictions of punishment. They were descriptions of natural consequences. This is the layer most religious people miss, and it's the layer that secular people dismiss without ever examining. The warnings in Scripture aren't about a divine being deciding to strike people down for bad behavior. They're about the way reality is structured. Deception corrodes trust, and trust is the foundation of every functioning relationship and institution. Injustice breeds resentment, and resentment, when it accumulates across generations, becomes upheaval. Pride, specifically the pride that makes people unable to receive correction, isolates a person from wisdom, and isolated from wisdom, they make catastrophic decisions. These aren't supernatural punishments. They're built into the structure of human experience, as reliable as gravity. The warning about pride is perhaps the most precise in all of Scripture. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. People cite this verse constantly, but they cite it as a platitude. They don't sit with what it actually means. It means that the psychology of arrogance, the specific mental state of a person or organization that has become incapable of hearing criticism, incapable of acknowledging error, incapable of updating its understanding of reality, that psychology contains within it the seed of its own collapse. Not because the universe punishes arrogance as a moral offense, but because arrogance produces a systematic blindness. And a blindness that is systematic, that is built into the way you process information, will eventually walk you into a wall you couldn't see coming. You don't need anyone to punish you. The blindness is the punishment. I've watched brilliant people destroy themselves with this. Companies that could not acknowledge they were losing relevance. Leaders who surrounded themselves only with agreement and drove straight into catastrophe. Families where a patriarch's inability to be questioned slowly poisoned every relationship in the house over decades. The Bible named this pattern with precision thousands of years before psychology gave it clinical language. Before we had terms like narcissistic personality structure or cognitive rigidity or confirmation bias, the ancient writers looked at human behavior and said, "Watch the proud ones. Watch what happens to them. Write it down so the next generation doesn't have to learn it from scratch." Go deeper still. The warnings about the tongue, about the power of words, are some of the most sophisticated observations about human nature in all of ancient literature. The book of James describes the tongue as a small thing that sets great forests on fire. That's not poetry for its own sake. That's a precise observation about how language functions in social systems. A single lie, told in the right context, to the right people, at the right moment, can destroy a reputation built over decades. A single careless word between friends can introduce a wound that never fully heals. A rumor repeated often enough, regardless of its truth, shapes the reality of everyone who hears it. The Bible treated words as having real-world weight and real-world consequence long before information theory or social psychology existed to explain the mechanism. And what most people miss is that the warning goes in both directions. It warns about the destructive power of a harmful speech, yes, but it also describes the power of truthful, precise, careful speech to build what destructive speech tears down. The same instrument, radically different outcomes depending on how it's used. That's not a religious observation. That's an empirical one. And the reason it still matters is that we live in an age where words travel faster and farther than at any point in human history. The ancient warning about the tongue now applies to everything we post, share, broadcast, amplify. The forest that gets set on fire now burns across entire nations in hours. The warning scaled up. We didn't. The warnings about anxiety and the human tendency toward worry reveal another layer of practical precision. Be anxious for nothing, says the text. And people read that as a command. Stop being anxious, as if willing it away were possible. But look closer. The surrounding context describes a practice. In everything, with prayer and thanksgiving, present your requests. It's describing a cognitive and behavioral process of releasing control over outcomes you cannot determine, while taking action on what you can. That's not mysticism. That's a functional description of how anxiety works and what interrupts it. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy arrived at remarkably similar conclusions through decades of clinical research. The ancient writers, watching human beings suffer under the weight of uncontrolled worry, wrote down what actually helped. And it still helps. The warnings about sexual ethics are the most contested in our time, and therefore the most important to examine without defensiveness. Leave aside the theological arguments entirely. Look only at the psychological and social observations embedded in the warnings. The Bible repeatedly connects sexuality to something deeper than physical experience, to identity, to vulnerability, to the architecture of trust between people. When it warns about sexual behavior that bypasses commitment, that treats intimacy as transaction, that separates physical union from covenant relationship, it isn't making a list of prohibited pleasures. It's describing a mechanism by which people become unable to trust deeply, unable to be fully known, unable to give or receive love at full depth. The research on attachment, on the psychology of intimacy, on the developmental consequences of treating connection as purely recreational, much of it, arrived at through completely secular methods, has confirmed what the warnings already described. Connect all of this, and you see something remarkable. Every major warning in Scripture is connected to every other warning through a single underlying idea, that there is a way things work, a structure to human flourishing, a pattern by which individuals and communities either build or collapse, and that deviation from that pattern has consequences that are not arbitrary but logical. not punitive, but structural. The warnings exist not because the universe is cruel, but because reality has a grain to it, the way wood has a grain. And cutting against the grain has predictable results regardless of your intentions, regardless of your sincerity, regardless of how sophisticated your justification for cutting against it happens to be. This is the hidden layer that most people never reach. This is what I wish someone had placed in my hands at 25 and said, read these not as rules imposed from outside, but as descriptions of how things actually function. Read the warning about debt as a description of what debt actually does to freedom and decision-making. Read the warning about anger as a description of what unresolved bitterness actually does to the body and to every relationship it touches. Read the warning about neglecting rest as a description of what the sustained absence of recovery actually does to productivity, creativity, and judgment over time. Every warning is a user manual for a complex system, the system of human beings living together in community across generations under pressure. The practical application is simply this: when you encounter something in life that isn't working, a relationship deteriorating, a financial situation spiraling, a personal pattern that keeps producing the same destructive outcome, before you reach for the newest theory or the most current advice, consider asking whether one of the old warnings already named exactly what you're experiencing. Not because old is automatically better, but because the patterns these warnings describe are not modern inventions. They are ancient constants. They were observed and recorded because the people who recorded them had watched, across multiple generations, what happened when human beings forgot the grain of the wood. They weren't speculating, they were documenting. At 78, what I know with certainty is this: the warnings were right. Not every interpretation ever made of them, not every cultural overlay built onto them across the centuries by people with their own agendas, but the core observations about power, about money, about pride, about words, about intimacy, about anxiety, about the internal logic of how human beings either flourish or collapse. Those were right, and they will still be right when every person alive today is gone. Because they are not describing one era's particular experience. They are describing something written into the structure of things, into the grain of the wood, and that grain does not change. The warnings were right, they are still right. And the cost of ignoring them is exactly what the warnings said it would be.